A man who knows the definition of vigilant citizen because he lives it every day. Ron Paul is back on Off the Grid. Senator Cory Booker want to reform the war on drugs. What's your plan to do that?
Well, of course, there's a certain senator that's been working more closely with Cory Booker, but I agree with it entirely. And that is to not, not to put people in prison for, nonviolent crimes. And also, we have to think about letting those prisoners out, pardon individuals that have committed these crimes that have been nonviolent. Matter of fact, when I was running for president, that was part of my position. Pardon them all, let them go, because they haven't committed a violent crime. Can you imagine now, with the understanding of the pros and cons of marijuana, how many people are still in prison over this? But it isn't so much the issue of the drugs themselves as who makes the tougher decisions? Who makes the decisions for alcohol and cigarettes, eating too much, not exercising enough? It should be with the individuals and not with government. That's where the real harm is done. So in many ways, legalizing the drugs and marijuana for me is just part of my program of wanting to legalize freedom of choice and making our own decisions and being responsible for all our acts.
And let me interject something here. Wouldn't it be better to have it done on the state level? I mean, like Colorado and Washington have voted to legalize marijuana. I'm sure other states are going to follow suit now because they're going to see the tax revenue that they get from it. And when you look at it, drinking ages are determined at a state level, at what level you can consume alcohol. Why would the federal government even be involved in this issue? Let the states handle it on their own. If a states want marijuana legal, let the state make it legal and get the feds out of it. You agree with that?
Well, Jesse, you're getting a little bit too radical. You're probably introducing a constitutional principle that we just don't talk about anymore. Certainly that's what it should be done. We wouldn't have these problems if we would have maintained this idea that the states were responsible for the issues like this. And they could mess up too, but the states would have to deal with it. But the one thing neat about what's happening in Colorado and Washington, these other states, it's nullification. This is what is good. So it was meant in our early history that if the federal government overreached and they were an overburden for the states could refuse to follow these laws. Well, that hasn't been very popular, but now, because of the federal government being so overbearing, states are now acting on their own, and ideas have consequences, so no matter how many people in Washington still think we have to arrest everybody that smokes marijuana, it's just not possible anymore. So yes, that is the legal solution, and it's the practical solution, because right now I think we're in the early stages of seeing a lot of nullification, and I think in the middle of a financial crisis, it will lead to a political crisis, which will naturally say governing has to come more locally, and the worse the states are, the more the individual have to be responsible for themselves. Because, self-government is very good and states should do it, but you get states like Michigan and others, they're totally bankrupt, but it would put pressure on them and no dependency on other individuals to bail them out, no dependency on the federal government, and this to me is a good move. Nullification is a good way to go.
I went through Colorado earlier this spring, and I didn't notice anything different there, Dr. Paul. Everything was doing pretty good. The people were happy, and I saw no repercussions whatsoever from their legalization of marijuana.
Well, the one repercussion, if you want to call it that, one consequence, hopefully the statistics will prove the crime rate will probably go down. Allow the people to have their guns, and because you can't depend on the police, and the government too often is participant in that. So yes, and you legalize the drugs. You really hurt the drug dealers. Isn't it interesting that the very strong fundamentalists who are good-hearted and they say, well, it's bad for kids kids. We have to make them illegal. We have to protect our kids. And at the same time, the drug dealers are on their side. No, keep it illegal. We'll put them out of business. But the alcohol companies are against legalizing marijuana too, and the drug companies are against it. They want to sell Valium. They don't want to allow people to maybe get a little relaxation with marijuana. And the alcohol companies, alcohol. I understand that alcohol can be pretty dangerous too. So alcohol people don't want drugs like this, and people using herbs, natural substances, to use it instead of something they can manufacture and make a lot of money and sell these drugs. So there are a lot of special interests that would like to keep drugs illegal.
Dr. Paul, to me, the bottom line is why all those groups oppose it is money. Because marijuana, you can grow it in your own backyard. It's a weed. Right. And so therefore, the loss of revenue is what they're looking at. They want you to have to buy their pills. They want you to have to buy their alcohol. But marijuana, you can grow it right in the backyard. And so to me, it comes down to the old follow the money thing. Anyway, speaking of law enforcement, what do you think of the militarization of our SWAT and police forces are playing into all the problems that we have right now?
Of course, I think it's horrible. I think the federal government ought to be out of it, and they shouldn't be passing out these weapons. They look like a military force. One thing that we tried to put into our law after the Civil War was the posse comitatus, that the military shouldn't be involved in civilian disputes, and the federal government at least, but that should apply to the state governments. We shouldn't militarize it, but here now we're having militarized police. One of the laws that was passed, and I strongly objected to all along, was that this confiscation, if somebody's caught doing drugs or any other thing, and the police confiscate, certain weapons, certain instruments, trains and planes and trucks and all, they get to keep it. It's off the books. I think that is very bad. But then the federal government makes it worse because they pass out this all these military weapons. I don't think for a minute there's any police force here that should have tanks. There's something wrong with the community and something wrong with what's going on. I do not know in a free society where you'd have to have the police armed with tanks in order to suppress the people.
Maybe I'm looking too far ahead, Ron, but could it be they're preparing for a martial law type situation?
I think they are. Some people think that they prepare to have it, but I think there are some individuals that look around and some of them might even remember the 60s. The 60s were a pretty rough time, there was a lot of violence and all. But I think now they probably understand the economy sort of like you and I do, and that it can be very serious and people may get violent. And if that is the case, and now with this Department of Homeland Security, and they think the federal government can make us perfectly secure. Well, that isn't even the purpose of government. The purpose of government is not to make us safe, it's to protect our liberties. And when they look at it and think, well, there could be a breakdown of civil society, then we might have to round up the people. Maybe we had a taste of it in Boston, the marathon bomber. Look at how they closed that city down. And look at what they did after the hurricane in New Orleans. So yes, they're always prepared, but they're the good people. They want to take care of the people and provide safety and security. If we put you in here, we're going to make you safe and secure. So it's a very dangerous trend, but for different reasons, I think different people endorse these ideas, but they shouldn't be in that business of providing places where they're going to hold people. Of course, World War II, look at what they did to the Japanese Americans. So these aren't brand new ideas. So governments are quite capable of acting in this very vicious manner.
Oh, I got in huge trouble in my conspiracy theory show when I showed how FEMA was building these 6 camps around the country to put people in that they claim if there's national disasters, we have to have somewhere to keep them. And I saw one of these places and I noticed the barbed wire fence pointed inward. In other words, to keep you in. That's how you judge barbed wire. If it's straight up and down, it's neutral. If it's facing out, it's to keep the people from the outside from getting in. But if it's facing in, it's to keep people from the inside getting out. And that's the way all the barbed wire was at this camp that I saw.
Yes. You talk about FEMA. And I live on the coast, and hurricanes come in, FEMA marches in, but I've taken this position for a long time, and everybody thought, well, that's political suicide. They're not going to elect you. You're not even for, the flood insurance. You're not for FEMA. And yet, it never hurt me. People were coming around to understanding that FEMA was a problem. They would come in and take over. They'd take over local private options. One hurricane problem we had on the coast in my district, I would try to go in. And no, the volunteers and the owners weren't allowed to go in. So people began to complain more about FEMA than begging about, oh yeah, FEMA will take care of us. So I think the people are further ahead than the country. I think the same thing happened on the drug war. I've been against this drug war for years and years, and yet it never seemed to hurt me politically in my district when they knew what I was talking about and I explained my position. So I still work on the assumption that the people are way ahead of the bureaucrats and the politicians in Washington, and that's why I think what you and I are doing is there's a fertile field out there to hear our message.
Ron, you've also talked about a proposal to abolish the CIA. That's pretty big, isn't it, to abolish the CIA? Have they run amok?
Yeah, that's secret government. I don't think the CIA should exist. I think in a true republic, you wouldn't have a CIA. I believe in military intelligence. If you're at war, during World War II, I think intelligence is very, very important. This is serious business. But this endless spying around the world, which is in collusion with our big corporation, there's as much commercial spying as there is political spying. So our CIA gets involved in torture, they get involved in rigging elections, overthrowing dictators. I mean, it is out of control. And, there are some, that actually think the CIA may have participated in some brutal killings, even in this country. But everything is secret. It's off the books. And if you get caught, we don't know that guy. He's not a CIA agent. So, no, I think the principle of the CIA, which very, very few congressmen have little information about the CIA. It's very tough to know exactly what's going on. And I imagine, even for a president, it might be very, very tough to know exactly what's going on with the CIA. So if we live in a true republic, I do not believe we would have a CIA, and of course we wouldn't have a Federal Reserve System either.
Ron, do you think that there's hope for 2016?
Well, I don't think the solutions are going to come in 2016. It'd be nice to get a lot of new people in Washington that agree with limited government and the Constitution, all the things that we are convinced are the correct way to go. But I don't think it can get turned around that fast. I don't think it has to be a pervasive idea with the people to understand why you do away with welfare. You do away with welfare because once you endorse the principle, you help the rich and not the poor. And the poor and the average person has to finally get convinced that all the baloney that we've heard from our college professors for 50, 60 years about their economic policies are complete failure. I think we have to go through a cataclysmic crisis and to have a breakdown of the system like the Soviets did. The Soviets broke down not because we beat them had to have a nuclear exchange with them. They beat themselves because they had a flawed philosophy. And I think we have a flawed philosophy. I think we've stretched ourselves too widely around the world. I think we spend too much money. We have too much debt. We have too much encroachment of our civil liberties. And it's going to come about with the economy really getting a lot worse, and then something will have to be done. I just don't see that happening in the next 2 or 3 years, but all the campaigning and all the efforts and trying to get people elected to be able to, spread this message is what I think is important. And, when I first went to Congress, I was out for 12 years and I went back in. I never felt like I was doing anything differently because in my own mind, I was always campaigning for liberty, believing that it was liberty that we needed, that it solved your economic problems, it solves the civil liberties problem. And if you truly understand what liberty is all about and non-aggression, we wouldn't be telling other countries what to do. And that is what I think the issue is understanding what true liberty is, accepting the consequences, both positive and negative, and not depend on somebody else and never use force to use the government to go and get something that you want or think you deserve.
And on that note, I think there's a great place to finish this interview on. Ron, I want to thank you again, Ron Paul, for returning to Off the Grid. Keep our conversations going online and at the addresses below. And as always, stay vigilant.
Just don't talk about anymore. Certainly that's what it should be done. We wouldn't have these problems if we would have maintained this idea that the states were responsible for the issues like this. And they could mess up too, but the states would have to deal with it. But the one thing neat about what's happening in Colorado and Washington, these other states, it's nullification. This is what is good. So it was meant in our early history that if the federal government overreached and they were an overburden for the states could refuse to follow these laws. Well, that hasn't been very popular, but now, because of the drugs themselves, is who makes the tougher decisions? Who makes the decisions for alcohol and cigarettes, eating too much, not exercising enough? It should be with the individuals and not with government. That's where the real harm is done. So in many ways, legalizing the drugs and marijuana, for me, is just part of my program of wanting to legalize freedom of choice and making our own decisions and being responsible for all our acts.
And you know, let me interject something here. Wouldn't it be better to have it done on the state level? I mean, like Colorado has, and Washington.
And that is to not, not to put people in prison for, nonviolent crimes. And also, we have to think about letting those prisoners out, pardon individuals that have committed these crimes that have been nonviolent. Matter of fact, when I was running for president, that was part of my position. Pardon them all, let them go, because they haven't committed a violent crime. Can you imagine now, with the understanding of the pros and cons of marijuana, how many people are still in prison over this? But it isn't so much the issue.
Washington have voted to legalize marijuana. I'm sure other states are going to follow suit now because they're going to see the tax revenue that they get from it. And when you look at it, drinking ages are determined at a state level, at what level you can consume alcohol. Why would the federal government even be involved in this issue? Let the states handle it on their own. If a states want marijuana legal, let the state make it legal and get the feds out of it. You agree with that?
Well, Jesse, you're getting a little bit too radical. You're probably introducing a constitutional principle that we just...
A man who knows the definition of vigilant citizen because he lives it every day. Ron Paul is back on Off the Grid. Senator Cory Booker want to reform the war on drugs. What's your plan to do that?
Well, of course, there's a certain senator that's been working more closely with Cory Booker, but I agree with it entirely.